In an earlier lecture, I told the story of how Eleanor Roosevelt came to Franklin Roosevelt's assistance, almost to his rescue, after he contracted polio and became disabled. And she encouraged him, almost insisted, that he eventually go back into politics. And eventually he did. Eleanor Roosevelt was something of Franklin Roosevelt's secret weapon during the 1920s. And I'm going to say more about Eleanor Roosevelt as Franklin Roosevelt's almost assistant president during the 1930s and 1940s. But I have to give a little bit of the backstory, a little bit more of the backstory on Eleanor Roosevelt. Because if Eleanor Roosevelt had made a decision in the couple of years before her husband contracted polio, and if she had made the decision differently than she did, then the outcome of his career might very well have been quite different. The history of the United States and indeed of the world might have been very different. And this is another instance in that category of events that I describe as where big history meets little history, where the history of nations, the history of war and peace, the history of big public events rubs up against little history, the history of private lives, the decisions that individuals make in their own private lives that have effects. They go far beyond those private lives. So I want you to imagine that you are Eleanor Roosevelt. And the year is 1918. It's at the end of World War I. Your husband, Franklin Roosevelt, has been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. This is a more responsible, a more important position than it might sound. Assistant Navy Secretary, there's hardly a Navy Secretary anymore, but the Navy Department in those days was a full-fledged cabinet department. And the Assistant Secretary was actually the one who did most of the heavy lifting. The actual Secretary was a political appointee. Franklin Roosevelt had taken the job because his uncle by marriage, his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had been Assistant Navy Secretary during the 1890s, and this had been a springboard for Theodore Roosevelt in his path to the White House. And Franklin Roosevelt had his eyes on the White House too. A word here about Franklin Roosevelt and his ambitions for president. For anybody, whether you're going to be a president or not, whether you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, whatever, one of the ways of figuring out at a young age whether you'd want to be something, be this, that, or the other thing, is to measure yourself against people you might know who do that thing. So if you think you want to be a lawyer, it's a good idea to try to get to know lawyers. Maybe there's a lawyer in your family, and maybe you've got an older brother or your uncle or your mother's a lawyer. And you think, okay, mom can do that, I can do that. And it tends to sort of demystify these things. This is why there are various career programs where you shadow somebody. You go spend a day with a doctor or spend a day with a realtor or somebody like that, and you see what they actually do. So, and this is invaluable. And it's something that rarely happens for people who think they want to be president, because there aren't that many presidents around, and they don't just let you come in and, follow them around. And there have been just a couple of cases in American history where somebody of college age, let's say, gets to measure himself against a sitting president. And John Quincy Adams was one. His father was president, and so John Quincy Adams figured, I'm as smart as Dad, I could become president too. Franklin Roosevelt's father wasn't president, but his uncle and cousin was president. And when Franklin Roosevelt was in college, he went to Harvard, like Uncle Ted, and when he was in college, he used to come by the White House and hang out there, and he could look at Uncle Ted and he could say, well, okay, if Uncle Ted could do it, I probably could do it. And so from an early age, he started to think about, how do I get to be president? This is unusual because most people become president. Most people start thinking they could actually be president only relatively late in their political careers. I mean, people idly dream about it, but to think you could actually do it, it could be me. That doesn't happen for most people until they get elected governor of something, or they get elected senator, or in rare cases, they're a victorious general or something like that. But with Franklin Roosevelt, it started early, and so he modeled himself after his uncle cousin. And so he became Assistant Navy Secretary. Anyway, so in that job, he had to spend a lot of time at the office. There was very good reason to do it. The nation was at war, and he was responsible for the Navy that was going to defend the United States from German U-boats and other enemy warcraft. And so he had every reason to tell Eleanor, honey, I got to work late tonight. And during the summer, when, as I think I explained in the earlier lecture, people who could cleared out of the cities during the summer in this era, first of all, before air conditioning, and secondly, before a polio vaccine. And so they didn't want to swelter away. And Washington, D.C. in the summer is miserable. It's kind of like Houston. Imagine Houston during the summer with no air conditioning. It was like that because there wasn't any air conditioning in this era. So typically in well-to-do families like the Roosevelts, the wife would take the kids and they would go to someplace on the shore or someplace in the mountains. The kids would stay safe. And typically the fathers would come along. Sometimes they'd come on weekends. Sometimes they would come for 2 weeks or something like that. Actually, during most summers, Washington, D.C. cleared out of the political classes because Congress wasn't in session. Congress knew enough not to be in session during the sweltering months. But the war changed it because the war didn't take summer vacations. And so especially members of the executive branch, they were on Congress's schedule, they were on the war schedule, they had to work pretty much summer round. And so Eleanor would take the kids and off they'd go to Campobello Island where the Roosevelts had a home. And Franklin Roosevelt would stay in Washington. He wasn't alone. There were all sorts of Washington government officials whose wives had left and they were there. And there were still around, there were dinner parties and receptions and things. And so typically the hostesses would want to find guests, the partner for somebody because they liked the idea to have an equal number of men and women around the dinner table. And so there was a habit of people like Franklin Roosevelt of inviting a secretary or something like this to dinner. Well, sort of this happened, and the woman he tended to invite along was, in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife's personal secretary. Her name was Lucy Mercer. She would become Lucy Mercer Rutherford, but Lucy Mercer. And Lucy was an attractive young woman, and she was enjoyable to be around, and so Franklin Roosevelt and Lucy Mercer became this item. And at first, nobody really thought anything of it. Okay, as I say, she was just his guest, his accompaniment at these dinners. And there were lots of other people doing the same thing. And but he always invited her. He didn't invite somebody from the office and somebody else. And so tongues started to wag that maybe there was something going on between Franklin and Lucy. And so Washington is a gossipy place. There's not much to do when government is in session but people to gossip. And so the gossips had a field day with this. And the word started to leak to Eleanor. I mean, Eleanor was off on the Maine coast, but she would get these letters from Franklin, who had said, okay, I'll be there this weekend. But the letter would say, oh, geez, looks like work is going to take me longer to finish than I thought. I'll come up next weekend. And the next weekend would be delayed. And she got kind of frustrated, and she got worried. And she heard the gossip that Franklin perhaps was carrying on with Lucy Mercer. And at first she tried to put it aside. She knew about the gossips in Washington, and in fact one of the worst gossips was a daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's cousin, Alice Roosevelt, at this point Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She had married a guy named Longworth. And Alice Roosevelt was the worst gossip monger around. And she also didn't much like Eleanor. Alice Roosevelt didn't much like anybody, really. But she loved to be the bearer of bad tidings. And so she used to tell Eleanor, "Oh, you wouldn't guess who I saw Franklin with this weekend." And Eleanor didn't want to encourage this sort of behavior, so she would just try to ignore it. But Alice would go on anyway and say, "It was that Lucy. You better watch out for Franklin." But Eleanor tried to put it aside and just, okay, she didn't want to deal with it. She wasn't going to honor the gossip by paying any attention to it, but she couldn't help developing some suspicions of her own. Well, this went on for a while, until 1918, as the war's winding down. Franklin Roosevelt, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, goes to Europe because as the war ends, he's going to have to figure out how to basically retrieve a lot of the material, the stuff, the ships and everything else that the Navy has sent over there. So he goes on a trip. And while he's gone, he writes letters home. He writes letters to Lucy. And Lucy writes letters to him. Now, if he hadn't gone to Europe in the course of his work, then what subsequently happened wouldn't have happened, at least it wouldn't have happened in the same way it did. Also, if Franklin Roosevelt had not inherited the Roosevelt habit of saving everything that came their way. So Lucy wrote to Franklin, and Franklin Roosevelt saved the letters. And these were love letters. It was clearly letters of a woman who was in a relationship with this guy, and presumably he was sending similar letters to her. But he didn't keep copies of those. He just kept copies of the letters she wrote to him. And even then, the fact that he kept the letters might not have led to what it did. Because what it did was, on the way home, Franklin Roosevelt fell ill. It was a 6, 8, 10-day ocean voyage, and he became seriously ill. Now, this was at the time of the worldwide Spanish influenza pandemic. What Roosevelt contracted apparently wasn't the flu, but it was something else, but it laid him low. And for the whole trip home, he was so ill he couldn't sit up. He was often almost delusional. And so he wasn't aware of his surroundings. In those days, ships could communicate with shore via telegraphy. And so somebody on the ship sent a message ahead to New York, where the ship was bound, saying that Franklin Roosevelt was ill. Would somebody make sure to notify his wife so she would be at the pier to meet him? And this, again, wasn't out of the ordinary. He'd been gone, and Eleanor wouldn't want to greet her husband when he came home. But he was still so sick when the ship landed that he couldn't carry his own luggage. And a Navy orderly carried his luggage and took Franklin and Eleanor to a townhouse they had on the Upper East Side in New York. And Franklin Roosevelt was still really sick. And he got home in bed, and he was still very sick. And because he was still very sick, Eleanor, as the good spouse, unpacked his luggage for him and discovered Lucy's love letters. And so here is undeniable evidence that her husband has been cheating on her. What is she going to do? And I ask you, what would you do if you were in Eleanor's position then? Now, I have to explain some of the surroundings. I haven't mentioned this, I've alluded to it, but they had children. They had 5 children. Some of the older kids were nearly grown, but there were 3 or 4 who were still rather young. And so this was a consideration. If they got divorced, what would become of the kids? Who would get custody of the kids? In those days, it would have been exceedingly unusual for the mother not to have received custody of the children. But Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to handle the kids all by herself, and she thought it would be good for the kids if the marriage stayed together. Another thing, divorce was difficult to accomplish in those days, and it was scandalous in the minds of all sorts of people. Someone who had been through a divorce was seen as defective in some way because, the traditional idea of marriage is you say, till death do us part. This is a very profound promise that you make. And if you can't keep your marriage promises, then who will trust you in business? Who will trust you in the law? Who would trust you in politics? Until then, in fact, until the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was elected, no one was elected president who had been divorced. And a divorce was seen as a career killer in politics. Again, when you go into politics, when you run for president of the United States, you're asking people to trust you. You're implicitly making a promise to the American people that I will fulfill my constitutional obligations. And if you can't hold a marriage together, how are you going to hold the country together? This was a common feeling. So Eleanor is considering this. She realized that if she wanted a divorce, she could get a divorce. She would be putting the family, she would be putting the children, she would be putting herself through the ringer. This would be front page news. This is a high-placed official in Washington, someone who seems to be going places in Democratic Party politics. And as I say, it was a career killer, so the newspapers would just lap this up and they'd play it all over the place. And the kids would have to deal with teasing at school and various other stuff. So it was something that Eleanor wouldn't do lightly. So she thought about it. She probably wouldn't suffer economically, at least not too much. Roosevelt, there was enough money in the Roosevelt family that he could pay alimony and child support, but if the two of them had to support two households, basically, his and hers and the kids, then they weren't, enormously wealthy, so there would have to be some cutbacks. So Eleanor thought about this, and she made a decision. And her decision was she wasn't going to insist on a divorce. Now, Franklin himself presumably could have said, no, I do want a divorce too, but he was in the wrong in this situation, and he wasn't anyone to say, sort of double down on the wrong by saying, okay, I've cheated on you and now I'm going to divorce you. That would really be seen as throwing Eleanor to the curb, aside from the disrespect, even the insult that he had paid her by carrying on with Lucy Mercer. So Franklin Roosevelt's not going to do it. But Franklin Roosevelt actually had other reasons for not wanting a divorce. Part of it was he realized the divorce would probably end his chances of being president, probably end his chances of being much of anything in American politics. Even if he wanted to go practice law, he'd have a hard time. And so he would probably be that person that people would whisper about when he went around the city or when people saw him. Yes, isn't that the nephew of Theodore Roosevelt who showed such promise, but then, oh my gosh, that scandal, what might have been. So Roosevelt didn't want to put himself in a position of being that guy about whom people said what might have been. There was something else as well, and that was Theodore Roosevelt's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt's middle name was Delano. It was a family name on his mother's side. And Sarah was the one who held the purse strings in the Roosevelt family. Roosevelt's father had died, and instead of leaving much money to Franklin, he left all the money, nearly all the money, to Sarah. And Sarah essentially put Franklin Roosevelt on an allowance. Now, it was a pretty generous allowance. He could live, and he could support his family in a fairly lavish lifestyle. But Sarah told Franklin that if he divorced Eleanor, or vice versa, if Eleanor divorced him, she would cut him, Franklin, off without a penny. Now, for someone who had never had to work in his life, for someone whose career expectation depended on this independent income, to be told he would have to actually go out and earn a living himself, this really brought him up. So it kept Roosevelt from thinking at all about wanting a divorce. And furthermore, Lucy Mercer was kind of a summertime affair. At some very basic level, Franklin Roosevelt still loved Eleanor. It didn't keep him from cheating on her, but he still loved her. And it's not at all clear that he, even with all that other stuff, he wanted to divorce her. And like Eleanor, and like most people in those days, divorce was thought to be bad for the children, and so he wouldn't want to do that. So the result of this was that Franklin and Eleanor did not get divorced. Now, is that the decision you would have made? You know, if you were in Eleanor's position, would you have said, wait a minute, clearly you don't love me, or at least you don't act like you love me, and I'm not going to take this disrespect, this insult of carrying on, and by the way, the world knows about it, at least everybody in Washington knows about it, and I've been humiliated. And so you're out of here, pack your bags and leave. Is that what you would have said? I'm just going to say, it would be a much easier, at least a less complicated thing to do today than it would have been then for all the reasons I've described. So you can go on, you can be successful in any field these days, and nobody really cares much if you've been divorced or not. But it wasn't in those days. Now there's one last element here that I haven't mentioned, and I can't at all prove that this was going through Eleanor Roosevelt's head. But I have to think there was something of it there, if only because of the way things turned out. Eleanor Roosevelt had political interests. She had political instincts, I might almost say. She was, after all, Theodore Roosevelt's niece, and she had been around politics. She had political interests. There were causes that she supported. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, this affair took place shortly before the passage of the constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote. So, Eleanor Roosevelt could have gone into politics if she wanted. Actually, I should add that the Constitution, well, first of all, the Constitution previously did not forbid women from voting. It just didn't guarantee them the right to vote. And most states had not accorded women the right to vote. But even in states where women couldn't vote, that didn't necessarily say they couldn't run for office. So in fact, a woman ran for President of the United States in 1872 at a time when most women couldn't vote, because there was nothing that barred her from being President of the United States. Well, it was kind of a stunt, actually. She wasn't quite old enough to be president. There was that constitutional bar. But anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt could see that this amendment allowing women to vote was coming down the road. And so she might very well have thought, okay, I don't need Franklin Roosevelt to exercise my political interest. But she did, because Eleanor Roosevelt did not have the temperament, she did not have the personality to put herself out for election. She could have thought about running for office, but it just wasn't her style. And there are plenty of people who eventually go into politics, but not elective politics. They go into appointive politics. So somebody else gets elected governor or president or mayor, and then those people hire secretaries of state and chiefs of staff and folks like that who get into politics that way, but they don't have to go through the rigors, they don't have to put themselves out in front of the people and ask for their votes and all this stuff. Eleanor Roosevelt fell in that second camp. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, part of her must have realized, I'm married to this guy who one day might be President of the United States if we don't screw it up by getting divorced. And if he becomes President of the United States, I could have great influence. I would be in a position where I could actually do great good for the causes I consider to be important. Now, again, I don't know how much of that was going through Eleanor Roosevelt's head. At the time, she had to make the deeply personal, emotional decision, do I stick with Franklin Roosevelt or not? But some of it might very well have been there. And in fact, because she stuck with Franklin Roosevelt, and then after he contracted polio in 1921, encouraged him, kept sort of pushing him back into politics, while Franklin Roosevelt was recuperating, Eleanor Roosevelt would travel around New York. They were living at Hyde Park, New York, above New York City, and she would go around and she would give speeches on Franklin Roosevelt's behalf, basically to keep the Roosevelt name in front of the attention of voters, preparing the way for a Franklin Roosevelt comeback. And she began developing interests of the things that she would like to see happen in politics. Well, with Eleanor's encouragement, Franklin Roosevelt did go back into politics in 1928, 7 years after he contracted polio. He ran for governor of New York, and he was elected governor of New York. He still had that vote-getting appeal. And although he campaigned from the backseat of an open car, and he gave press conferences sitting down behind his desk so people couldn't see that he couldn't walk, he was a very gregarious person. He was a very attractive personality. And Eleanor Roosevelt became the First Lady of New York. And in that position, Eleanor Roosevelt was able to promote causes she considered to be important. Eleanor Roosevelt was more of a liberal than her husband. She had more concern for the downtrodden, for poor children, for their mothers, for the health care of people. She was more alive, or at least she was more willing to put herself out for improvement in the civil rights of African Americans. And when her husband became governor of New York, she became First Lady of New York, she got a chance to promote some of these causes, and she would go out and speak on behalf of these causes, and she would speak to her husband on behalf of these causes, and she would try to try to persuade Franklin Roosevelt to take up these causes in his policies. Franklin Roosevelt got re-elected governor of New York in 1930. Now, by this time, the Great Depression had set in, and as governor of New York, Roosevelt got to test out his ideas on how to deal with the Depression, how to help people who all of a sudden were out of work and out of incomes, what sort of welfare programs, what sort of income support programs were, how to get government to hire people, to put people back to work, how to reorganize the economy and maybe consolidate banks and to keep the strong banks from going under, being dragged under by the weak banks. New York at this time was the most populous state in the nation. And so being governor of New York was the closest approximation to being president of the United States. And Roosevelt did well as governor, was perceived to be doing very well, and so he was a natural for the Democratic nomination in 1932 to run against the incumbent Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover had lots of talent, and he might have been a perfectly good president except for the Great Depression. And when the Great Depression hit, he wasn't quite sure how to deal with it. He was an individualist at a time when Americans were thinking more in communitarian terms. And also, he was just the one who happened to be on the job when the roof collapsed on the stock market, on the American economy, so voters were willing to blame him. And they were willing to give a try to Franklin Roosevelt, which meant that Eleanor Roosevelt now became First Lady of the United States. And Eleanor Roosevelt found herself as one of her husband, the President of the United States' most influential advisors. And Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt had sort of a tag team approach. So Eleanor was known to be more liberal than her husband. Now, her husband could say, I would be more liberal if politics would allow it. But an important element in the Democratic Party politics of the day were a bunch of conservative Southerners. And so they would not support civil rights reform and a federal anti-lynching law. No, they don't want to have anything to do with that. Franklin Roosevelt, in his heart, would have been happy to support it, but politics wouldn't allow it. But he let Eleanor go out and say, my husband is with you in spirit, it's just that politics won't allow it. And so Roosevelt, as president, got credit in some cases for being more liberal than he really was willing to be, because Eleanor could carry that liberal message out there. And if the conservatives in the party said, we don't like what Eleanor is doing, then Franklin Roosevelt could say, oh, well, what can you do with your wife? She's going to say what she's going to say. So Eleanor Roosevelt became the most influential woman in American political history during the 12 years that her husband was President of the United States. He died suddenly in 1945, and she no longer had that position. But she had such stature in the country, and in the Democratic Party in particular, that she remained one of the most influential people in the Democratic Party and in the United States until her death in the early 1960s. So Eleanor Roosevelt, at that moment when she had to decide, should I divorce him or not, maybe if some of that decision had to do with, he's my ticket to political influence, well, if that was part of her decision-making process, her gamble paid off, and she became one of the most prominent figures in American political life.